At dawn, a flat field looked like the staging area for an armored division. From a distance, the silhouettes were convincing. Long barrels, turret humps, the low bulk of tanks and half-tracks clustered beneath frost-kissed grass. Up close, they were rubber seams and canvas stretched over frames. The engines never started. Men did not climb the turrets. The only life came from a series of speakers set on low tripods, pushing out the wheeze and clank of a convoy recorded somewhere else and looped until the ear accepted it as truth. Somewhere on the German side of the wire, a scout sent a terse message. Enemy division observed at Grid X. Commanders shifted their maps. Radios reallocated artillery. Men miles away were ordered to hold. In a war where information was as lethal as high explosive, a company of artists and sound technicians had just painted a reality that cost the other side precious time and attention. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the unit the press would later call the Ghost Army, and the way a mixture of canvas, recorded noise, and administrative theater became one of World War II's most unsettling tools. A psychological weapon that redirected decisions by creating plausible illusions. They did not fight in the conventional sense. They fought perception. Their mission was to make enemy commanders see what the Allies wanted them to see, and to believe it fast enough to change the course of an operation. The effect was tactical. Units diverted, reinforcements delayed, attacks met with less resistance. The effect was moral. Artists and technicians turning their craft into instruments of deception, carrying the weight of decisions they helped catalyze. By mid-1944, Allied commanders faced a stubborn arithmetic. They had to move men and material across Europe, protect bridges and flanks, and execute operations with far fewer resources than the size of the enemy might suggest. Every real armored column that moved risked detection. Every concentration of force invited airstrikes and counterattack. If you could make the enemy misunderstand where the real threats were, you could force them to commit scarce reserves to the wrong place. That was the logic behind strategic deceptions, such as the enormous Allied misdirection around the Normandy landings. It was also the logic that birthed a far more intimate tactical instrument. A mobile unit that would masquerade as corps and divisions at a scale small units could support. German command structures were conditioned to believe what reconnaissance reported and to trust repeated corroborated signals. In the German information environment, repetition and confirmation, multiple reports from scouts, radio traffic, and physical signs like tracks and camps built a narrative that the staff accepted. The Axis war machine was not infallible. It was vulnerable to the same human heuristics that guide any command center under stress. A believable pattern, convincingly staged, could push staffers toward decisions that made sense on paper but were wrong on the ground. The Ghost Army exploited those heuristics not by brute force but by manufacturing the signals that produced credibility. A useful way to understand why such signals carry weight is to think about two different systems that both relied on controlling what people perceived. On one side was the German industrial propaganda machine that used radio and print to shape the beliefs of an entire populace. On the other was a small Allied unit using artifice to shape the perceptions of field commanders and scouts. Both operated on the same principle. Control the channel, repeat the message, and the other side will act as if the message were true. The scale and moral context differ dramatically, but the psychological mechanics, repetition, plausible detail, and the appearance of consensus were remarkably similar. It was this understanding of perception as terrain that led to an unusual recruitment drive. The 23rd was not filled with classic combat armsmen. Instead, the Army sought painters, set designers, sound engineers, radio men, camouflage experts, and anyone who could build convincing facsimiles or simulate the acoustic signature of battalions. Men with advertising backgrounds, theater experience, and wartime design skills were a particular asset. They could think in terms of audience, viewpoint, and believability. The unit's roster read like a gallery list and a radio studio payroll rather than a conventional order of battle. From their formation, secrecy was absolute. The missions were classified. In many cases, the men themselves did not know the full effect their work would have beyond the immediate tactical objectives. They were told to be believable and to vanish when the real units moved in. They learned techniques that crossed artistic craft with military necessity, how to paint foam to catch sunlight like steel, how to rig canvases so that from the enemy's most likely observation points they resembled armored turrets, how to orchestrate soundscapes that gave the distant impression of columns rolling through muddy fields. The visual tools were the most iconic. Inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, mock-ups of American and British equipment could be set up in minutes. From afar and from aerial photography of the era, the shapes read as real. Shadows fell where shadows were expected, proportions matched those the enemy had seen before, and movement, when required, was staged in ways that told an appropriate story. Sometimes the decoys were complemented by painted netting and false tracks cut into the earth with boards and ropes. The idea was always to create a coherent tableau. If a German aerial photo or a ground patrol came upon the scene, the gestalt would pass inspection. A silhouette at the right angle, the faint smear of a smokestack painted on a canvas, the right spacing between vehicles could be enough. Sound was the other signature. The unit carried large record players, amplifiers, and horn-like speakers mounted on trestles. They played tapes with pre-recorded sounds of tanks grinding over cobblestones, engines revving, crews shouting orders, acoustic elements captured from real units. Operators learned to mask the origin of the sounds by placing speakers along roads and in fields so the ears of the listener would triangulate the audio to the wrong place. Sound could be timed to match expected movement schedules, reinforcing the visual tableau. To a listening enemy, those speakers spoke of life, movement, readiness, and presence. Sound had a peculiar power because it implied motion and logistics, things visual decoys could only suggest statically. It was one thing to see a rubber tank, it was another to hear it shift its gears and roll out at night. Radio deception, however, may have been the most insidious tool. The Ghost Army included trained radio operators who could replicate the cadence, call signs, and procedural shorthand of real units. They sent scripted chatter, false logistics requests, and routine check-ins intended to look like the digital fingerprints of an actual formation. To an enemy intercept unit accustomed to pattern recognition, these transmissions were the final and often decisive element of proof. Where a canvas or a speaker could be doubted, live-sounding radio traffic completed the picture. The psychological effect followed a simple logic. If radio spoke as if a division existed, and the visuals corroborated, and the sounds confirmed movement, then the safest assumption for a cautious commander was that the division existed. Administrative mimicry rounded out the toolbox. Signs pointing to supply dumps, unit patches displayed in a staged headquarters, and the occasional printed leaflet suggesting a planned advance added bureaucratic weight to the illusion. This was not mere ornamentation. Armies are, in part, organizations of records and convention. When paperwork and insignia present a consistent narrative, a command center that thrives on bureaucratic confirmation treats those signals as further validation. The Ghost Army recognized that believability depended on multiple independent cues converging on the same conclusion. All these techniques worked because they exploited a basic truth about decision-making under uncertainty. People believe the story that is supported by the most apparently independent pieces of evidence. Visuals, audio, radio, and paperwork, when all aligned, were the building blocks of a compelling story. The Ghost Army's skill lay in synchronizing those elements so they did not merely mimic an army's appearance, but recreated the pattern of life an observer would expect of one. The men who did this work were seldom the same people who intended to profit from the illusion. Their moral reckonings were complicated. Some understood immediately the tactical virtue of saving lives by diverting enemy fire. Others wrestled with the idea of crafting deception that might lead to casualties elsewhere. Many carried the certainty that their work was a necessary form of warfare. Others later confessed unease at having used artistry to produce lethal consequences. Those conversations, private, messy, and unresolved, became a recurring theme in the unit's post-war memory. Practically, building an illusion was a matter of choreography as much as fabrication. A visual setup required an assessment of vantage points. Camouflage experts would study likely observation axes, roads, hills, bridges, the routes an enemy aerial reconnaissance plane would take. Decoys were positioned so that the most probable photographs would show convincing compositions. Weather and light were factors. Fog could help. Bright sun could betray the telltale sheen of rubber. The men learned to paint, scuff, and dirty their dummies so that they read as used hardware. When movement was necessary, the unit orchestrated it with precision. One truck would start, the sound squad would begin playing convoy audio, and a line of men would create tracks or drag tarps to simulate tire impressions. The deception had to be internally consistent or it would unravel. Sound deception required both technical savvy and dramaturgy. Recordings were not generic noise tracks. They were sequences that imitated an army's life cycle. Idle engines at dawn, convoy acceleration, pauses for resupply, the cadence of radio calls, and the occasional sharp command. Operators learned to modulate volume and placement so that the listening enemy would perceive directionality. They used multiple overlapping speakers to create the illusion of depth and distance, a skill borrowed from theater sound design but applied to military ends. The result was an auditory painting. Enough motion to make a scout report movement, enough detail to make a staffer believe artillery had arrived. Radio impersonation demanded discipline. The operators had to mimic correct call signs, use appropriate procedural language, and avoid the kinds of errors that would ring false to experienced signal interceptors. Scripts were constructed with plausible logistics requests and routine traffic. In some cases, the deception included controlled mistakes. An operator might simulate a hurried or confused call that, while flawed, had the ring of lived combat stress, thereby enhancing credibility. It was a paradox. Convincing performance sometimes required simulated imperfection. The administrative side, signs, fake headquarters tents, staged staff cars, added bureaucratic plausibility. A single staged conversation between a lieutenant and a supply sergeant, overheard or intercepted, could anchor an entire illusion. Unit patches sewn on fatigues and mock orders dropped where the enemy might find them created a paper trail. Even the way soldiers arranged mess cans and latrine areas mattered. Such mundane details signaled permanence. The Ghost Army understood that armies are judged not only by their hardware, but by the mundane accoutrements of daily life. Make the mundane appear routine, and you make the larger picture believable. How did these abstract techniques play out in the field? The unit's operations were varied and tailored to the tactical need. In some instances, the mission was simple: distract the enemy while a bridge was blown or a real division slipped past. In others, the objective was to suggest the presence of forces where none existed, to tie down enemy reserves ahead of an Allied offensive. One particularly illustrative engagement occurred in late 1944 in an area the unit later identified in declassified reports as indefinido. The plan called for an elaborate multi-sensory deception to suggest the buildup of an armored force preparing to threaten a key sector. Planners started with the map. They selected a location along a minor road network that would be visible to enemy aerial reconnaissance and within range of German scouts operating from a nearby village. The Ghost Army would not merely park a few dummies and play recordings. The operation was choreographed to convince both aerial surveillance and the human eyes on the ground. Inflatable tanks were distributed in clumps to mimic assembly areas. Canvas trucks were lined along a route in staggered intervals as if waiting to move. The sound crew positioned speakers along a narrow track leading toward the mock concentration, set to a scheduled playback that would mimic nighttime convoy noise. Radio operators prepared scripts simulating routine coordination between division and corps. Administrative artifacts, fake maps, tinted command posts, and a few planted orders completed the tableau. Execution required timing. At dusk, hidden men moved into position and inflated the tanks, brushed them with dirt, and arranged tarpaulins to imitate oil stains and wear. As night fell, the sound array began to emit the low rumble of engines, a cadence that suggested hundreds of vehicles moving into staging. At a predetermined hour, radio traffic began, the sort of prosaic, bureaucratic-sounding chatter that, when intercepted, looks like the background noise of an active unit. The next morning, an Allied aerial photo that would eventually be seen by German analysts showed what appeared to be a significant concentration of armored vehicles and support elements in a position threatening a nearby town. Scouts passing by the field filed reports that echoed the photograph. Movement observed, heavy equipment present, advance parties seen leaving to reconnoiter. What mattered most in the hours after the operation began was not any single signal, but the cumulative weight of them. The visuals provided the scene, the sound suggested movement and mass, and the radio traffic gave the signatures of logistical reality. For those on the German side who were already primed to expect Allied offensive activity, the convergence of inputs created a narrative of immediacy. Staffers reallocated forces accordingly. Units that might otherwise have moved to reinforce a real Allied attack were held back, ordered to strengthen the threatened sector instead. Field commanders with limited reserves faced a decision: risk thinning an already stretched line or believe the mounting evidence and reposition. There is an important epistemological caution in evaluating these outcomes. Attributing a specific change in enemy behavior to a single deception is always probabilistic rather than absolute. Enemy command decisions emerge from multiple sources: human judgment, intelligence from other fronts, logistics, and orders from higher authority. Deception operates by skewing the probabilities in favor of one interpretation over another. In the Indefinito operation, German responses, documented in intercepted communications and later intelligence summaries, suggest they took the bait. They shifted artillery assets and delayed reinforcement to a real front that needed them. How much that shift contributed to the success of subsequent Allied maneuvers is measurable only within a margin of inferential uncertainty. What can be said with greater confidence is that a convincing synthetic presence had produced a measurable change in where German commanders chose to place their attention. When the Ghost Army's role in such operations is clear, the moral question returns. Those who inflated tanks and spun tapes rarely watched the downstream consequences in real time. They were removed by the fog of war from the exact moments when enemy forces redeployed, and sometimes when soldiers on both sides paid the cost. After the war, many members of the unit reflected on that distance with unease. Some argued that deception saved lives by preventing frontal assaults or by ensuring a real crossing faced reduced opposition. Others found the moral calculus less tidy. Deception, after all, does not discriminate where it funnels danger. Its success might equal fewer casualties in one engagement and more in another, depending on how the enemy responded. Secrecy compounded the ethical difficulty. For decades, the record of these operations remained classified, and the veterans carried the knowledge in silence. Recognition arrived unevenly and late, and with it came stories of pride tangled with ambivalence. Veterans recounted the technical virtuosity of their work, the way a painted seam could catch a reconnaissance photo's light, the precise timing of a tape to give depth to a soundscape. They also told of being asked to create convincing scenes that would, by design, mislead human beings, making life or death decisions. When the Ghost Army's role in such operations is clear, the moral question returns. Those who inflated tanks and spun tapes rarely watched the downstream consequences in real time. They were removed by the fog of war from the exact moments when enemy forces redeployed, and sometimes when soldiers on both sides paid the cost. After the war, many members of the unit reflected on that distance with unease. Some argued that deception saved lives by preventing frontal assaults or by ensuring a real crossing faced reduced opposition. Others found the moral calculus less tidy. Deception, after all, does not discriminate where it funnels danger. Its success might equal fewer casualties in one engagement and more in another, depending on how the enemy responded. Secrecy compounded the ethical difficulty. For decades, the record of these operations remained classified, and the veterans carried the knowledge in silence. Recognition arrived unevenly and late, and with it came stories of pride tangled with ambivalence. Veterans recounted the technical virtuosity of their work, the way a painted seam could catch a reconnaissance photo's light, the precise timing of a tape to give depth to a soundscape. They also told of being asked to create convincing scenes that would, by design, mislead human beings, making life or death decisions. That tension, the artist as weapon, became a signature element of the Ghost Army's legacy. The tactical payoff, when measurable, was real. Divisions were sometimes repositioned, artillery fire shifted, and air assets diverted. At the operational level, the ability to shape enemy expectations reduced the need for manpower in certain sectors and allowed real units to exploit misallocations. Yet the broader strategic impact was always qualified. Deception was a force multiplier, not a panacea. It did not win wars single-handedly. It created opportunities that other elements of planning and execution could exploit. To claim otherwise would be to romanticize a particular form of cunning as a substitute for logistics, bravery, or command. The Ghost Army also left a technological and doctrinal imprint. The techniques they used, synchronized visual, sonic, and signal deception, provided a template for later psychological operations and battlefield information strategies. The conceptual through-line was simple and unnerving. Manipulate what the other side believes to be true, and you can influence what they will do. That lesson did not remain confined to tactical deception. It migrated into broader understandings of information warfare in the decades that followed. As the Infindido operation entered its crucial phase, the unit prepared for extraction. The objective was not to engage. It was to vanish after the scene had been absorbed into enemy intelligence. That was the other art of the Ghost Army, not only to create a believable lie, but to remove the props before the truth could be discovered. Men moved through the field in the pre-dawn, deflating rubber, packing speakers, and erasing footprints. The aim was to leave no trace that could immediately contradict the narrative the enemy had accepted. But traces remained. German staff notes, later declassified, recorded staff discussions and orders that reflected the new assessments. A report sent to a sector commander noted the presence of significant armored formations and advised caution. The presence of that single memo could change the allocation of reserves across a wide front. From the Allied perspective, the operation appeared to have succeeded. Enemy attention was elsewhere. From a human perspective, the result was more ambiguous. Somewhere in that realigned map were soldiers who would meet or not meet other soldiers based on a chain of beliefs and counterbeliefs. The unit's designers had constructed a reality that changed how humans decided to fight and where they chose to place themselves in harm's way. It is at this juncture, the moment of vanishing and the immediate ripple in enemy decision-making, that the narrative tension tightens and the ethical framing deepens. The Ghost Army's operations were not mere technical puzzles, they were interventions into human judgment under pressure. The next phase of the story concerns how the effects of that intervention played out in operations connected to the Infindido deception, the downstream tactical shifts it enabled, and the later declassification that revealed both success and murky consequences. These revelations would challenge both historians and participants to reckon with what it means to fight with illusion rather than with metal and fire. In the hours after the props were gone, the map on the German staff table no longer matched what anyone on the ground could see, and that mismatch was exactly the point. Reports and orders that had been nudged by the Ghost Army did not evaporate with the deflated rubber. The printed memo advising caution, the map annotation reallocating artillery, the radio log noting a phantom division's approach, these persisted in the paperwork and the minds that used them. Those artifacts altered the probability calculus for commanders far from the empty field. where to send reinforcements, which sector to reinforce by nightfall, whether to conserve ammunition for a threatened assault or to re-aim it toward the supposed concentration. In several well-documented files later unearthed from both Allied and Axis archives, staff notes caught staffers arguing over reallocation decisions that, when traced backward, intersected with intelligence streams the Ghost Army had seeded. In other words, the operation had done its work not by destroying tanks or killing soldiers, but by shifting attention and assets in ways that other commanders found operationally significant. What the Allies exploited was simple human economizing under uncertainty. Commanders have to choose where to be worried, and they will be worried where the evidence appears thickest. The Ghost Army thickened evidence in very particular ways, layering visual cues, acoustic clues, signal traffic, and administrative detritus so that even a cautious chief of staff would accept the presence of force as the safer hypothesis. This is why the unit's success was rarely binary. Often the effect was a delay of hours, seldom weeks, a postponement of a reinforcement movement, not an entire campaign lost. But in mechanized warfare where timing can separate a successful assault from a costly entrapment, a few hours could translate into meaningful tactical advantage. Those hours were the currency of the Ghost Army's power. The downstream chain of events from one such deception offers a representative picture. After the mock concentration in Indefinito, the German corps in that sector ordered 2 reserve battalions to prepare for rapid redeployment. Intelligence cables, some intercepted by Allied signals units and later included in post-war reports, show staffers expressing surprise at the sudden armored buildup. Higher headquarters, concerned about a possible breakthrough, held one of its Panzer Grenadier regiments within the threatened area rather than issuing it to another commander who was planning an offensive nearby. That constraint, in turn, reduced the local enemy manpower available to blunt an Allied probe across a river some miles away. The probe found careful opposition but encountered fewer prepositioned anti-tank teams than anticipated. Planners later wrote that the space allowed for a safer crossing window. Historians examining the operational record can point to timelines that are consistent with the notion that the deception had contributed to the favorable conditions. Even so, the effect remains a probabilistic one. The Ghost Army created the circumstances that made success easier for others, not the solitary cause of a victory. Those who performed the deception rarely watched those consequences in sequence. Most operators left the scene before the downstream tactical actions unfolded. That distance insulated them in 2 ways. It spared them from seeing the immediate human cost of decisions they had shaped, and it complicated their moral appraisal afterward. Veterans of the 23rd would later offer a range of feelings about that distance. Some framed their work in utilitarian terms: the diversion of enemy fire, the protection of crossing parties, the avoidance of frontal assaults, as morally defensible because it could reduce overall casualties. Others dwelled on a less tidy ambivalence: the knowledge that a false picture on a map might cause death elsewhere, and the admission that artistic skill had been willingly redirected toward imprecision, not truth. Secrecy amplified the moral confusion. For decades following the war, the operations of the 23rd remained tightly classified. The men carried their stories privately. Their families knew that their sons had performed unusual wartime duties, but not the details or the full import. Recognition, when it came, was belated and fragmented. Declassification of operational files occurred in stages, with key documents remaining closed long after veterans had aged. When historians and journalists began to assemble the unit's record, a narrative of technical ingenuity and theatrical cunning emerged, but it was always shaded by the fact that the public could see only fragments of the total picture. The secrecy that had enabled operational surprise in wartime had the side effect of postponing public reckoning with what such deception meant. That delay in public scrutiny shaped how the Ghost Army was remembered. Early post-war accounts tended to gloss their role into a curiosity, a quirky wartime oddity about inflatable Sherman tanks and sound trucks. Only later, as more files were released and researchers traced causal chains in operational archives, did a fuller picture materialize. a sophisticated program of multimodal deception that routinely altered enemy decision-making at the tactical and operational levels. Even so, the historical consensus remains cautious. Where declassified German staff notes and Allied after-action reports allow, scholars have assembled plausible accounts showing that the 23rd contributed to or influenced specific outcomes. Where the trail runs thin, historians prefer to leave the claim probabilistic and contextual. The veterans' post-war public voices, those who eventually spoke in interviews, memoirs, or oral histories, made the unit's human texture visible. They described the odd, almost ludicrous combination of skills that came together. Scenic painters who knew how to weather a rubber turret to look like spent metal. Radio men who could reproduce the bureaucratic tics of a cornet. Recording engineers who layered noise tracks to produce believable depth. They also described the tedium and the artistry side by side. Hours spent rubbing tar into a canvas tank to make it look used. Nights of looping the same convoy noises until operators could set the playback to the rhythm of a real unit. These recollections highlight an uncomfortable intimacy. The same craft that animates stage illusions was here enlisted to animate lethal possibilities. Moral reflection among these practitioners varied. A recurring theme in interviews was the idea of necessary deception. In wartime, the deliberate distortions aimed at the enemy are an accepted instrument. Many veterans argued that their work reduced the need for bloodier options. Others, however, were candid about a residual unease. One could read a truly persuasive lie as an ethical weapon, powerful and indiscriminate in where it sent danger. The tension sits at the core of any ethical appraisal of military deception. It is not merely a question of technique, but of consequence. When you change someone's belief about where danger lies, you also change where people will stand and where they will be hit. Those reflections feed into a broader, more uncomfortable lesson about technological and artistic innovation in war. Skill is morally agnostic. A theatrical set builder can use the same competencies to stage a play or to stage a battle. The moral valence of the work depends on context and purpose. For members of the 23rd, context was a global war against an existential foe. For historians and ethicists, context provides neither an absolute exculpation nor a blanket condemnation. The point instead is one of responsibility and transparency. Secrecy may be militarily necessary, but it creates a long shadow over how societies remember and judge the uses of creative skill in war. Beyond moral questions, the Ghost Army's techniques left a concrete doctrinal imprint. The integrated use of visual, sonic, and signal deception became an explicit subject of military instruction in the decades after the war. Lessons learned about the importance of multiple independent cues, how sound could confirm visual suggestion, how radio traffic could finalize an illusion, found their way into manuals and the training of psychological operations units. The conceptual lineage is direct. What the 23rd demonstrated in the fields of Europe was that perception management, when executed with discipline and coordination, could be a force multiplier. That lesson influenced Cold War thinking about disinformation campaigns, camouflage doctrine, and tactical deception. Making a direct technological or procedural line from the 23rd to a specific modern tactic risks oversimplification. Techniques evolve, contexts vary, but the conceptual through line is unmistakable. If you can present a consistent, corroborated picture to an adversary, you can alter their behavior. That is the same psychological logic that underpinned other wartime information efforts, whether demonstrations on the battlefield or propaganda broadcast across a radio network. This brings into focus a comparative point. The Ghost Army's artifice and the mass propaganda campaigns of the Axis may occupy wildly different moral universes and operational aims, but both rested on Allied psychological mechanisms. The Axis exploited monopoly of media and emotional resonance to shape public opinion. The Ghost Army orchestrated sensory and bureaucratic signals to shape tactical judgment. Both show how controlling signals, what people perceive as real, can become as consequential as controlling territory. This commonality is not an equivalence. Domestic propaganda seeks political domination and consent. Battlefield deception seeks military advantage against an enemy with hostile intent. The measures of legitimacy differ, and so do the ethical frameworks that evaluate them. Still, the parallel is analytically useful. In both cases, repetition, plausibility, and the appearance of consensus do heavy cognitive work. They create a narrative that is easier for recipients to accept than to question in the fog and friction of war. In the years after classification eased, historians began to assemble a more complete narrative of the 23rd's missions. Scholars cross-referenced Allied after-action reports, intercepted German signals, and the unit's own fragmentary records. Multiple case studies now show the same pattern repeated. A layered deception staged at the right time created a credible threat in enemy assessments, which in turn induced shifts in disposition, created operational windows, and sometimes exposed strategic seams. The strength of the historian's claim depends on the amount and quality of documentary evidence linking the deception to specific enemy reactions. This commonality is not an equivalence. Domestic propaganda seeks political domination and consent. Battlefield deception seeks military advantage against an enemy with hostile intent. The measures of legitimacy differ, and so do the ethical frameworks that evaluate them. Still, the parallel is analytically useful. In both cases, repetition, plausibility, and the appearance of consensus do heavy cognitive work. They create a narrative that is easier for recipients to accept than to question in the fog and friction of war. In the years after classification eased, historians began to assemble a more complete narrative of the 23rd. Scholars cross-referenced Allied after-action reports, intercepted German signals, and the unit's own fragmentary records. Multiple case studies now show the same pattern repeated. A layered deception staged at the right time created a credible threat in enemy assessments, which in turn induced shifts in disposition, created operational windows, and sometimes exposed strategic seams. The strength of the historian's claim depends on the amount and quality of documentary evidence linking the deception to specific enemy reactions. That is why careful accounts always hedge. The Ghost Army helped induce or contributed to adjustments in enemy posture rather than caused them in an exclusive sense. The unit's legacy also lives in cultural memory. Exhibitions, books, and documentaries that have taken up the story emphasize its strange marriage of art and war. In museums, a deflated rubber hull or a weathered canvas sidewall now serves as an artifact not only of ingenuity, but of the ethically ambiguous labor of concealment. For many visitors, the image of artists and engineers at work on deception creates a cognitive dissonance that prompts questions rather than comfortable pride. That dissonance is itself historically important. It reminds us that military victory can be achieved by many means, and that not all means sit easily with the narratives we prefer about honor and direct confrontation. The 23rd story has practical lessons for contemporary information environments as well. Modern conflicts, like those of 1944, hinge on what actors believe about the positions, intentions, and capacities of rivals. Today, however, the channels are more numerous and the speed of amplification far greater. Where the Ghost Army had to plant visual cues that would survive examination by reconnaissance and intercept radio traffic that would pass muster with signal analysts, contemporary actors can attempt to shape perception across social platforms, satellite feeds, and global news cycles. The scale and velocity differ. The psychology does not. Repetition, the appearance of independent corroboration, and plausible detail remain the currency of credible deception. The cautionary lesson is that these techniques can be used at a distance, at scale, and with a speed that amplifies both intended effects and unintended harms. That caution is why historians, ethicists, and military professionals return repeatedly to the Ghost Army when discussing the ethics of information operations. The unit demonstrates how technical cleverness can produce tactical advantages while leaving moral questions unresolved. It shows the value of transparency, both as a post-war corrective and an ethical check, and it shows the costs of secrecy, which include delayed recognition and stalled public reckoning. It also offers a pragmatic reminder. If the objective is to change behavior, then a credible story composed of multiple reinforcing elements will be more effective than any single form of deceit. As the surviving veterans of the 23rd grew old, their accounts matured from triumphalist anecdotes to reflective examinations. Some embraced the narrative that their work saved lives and shortened campaigns. Others admitted uneasiness, not because the ends were wrong, but because the shape of the means bore the imprint of deception performed by artists who could have been creating anything else. Their testimonies, collected in oral histories and interviews, provide a human ledger that balances technical achievement against moral complexity. These are not new problems. War always leverages human creativity. But the Ghost Army crystallizes them in a particularly stark fashion. The theater of production, the soundtrack of machinery, and the paperwork of bureaucracy combine to make belief a battlefield. The unit's final institutional legacy is modest but telling. The tactics and operational art it developed did not remain curiosities. Elements of the 23rd's methods were studied, refined, and adapted. Military manuals began to codify deception principles. The need for synchronization across disciplines, the use of corroborating independent cues, and the importance of rapid setup and takedown. Psychological operations units that followed in the Cold War would borrow the principle of believable multiplicity, the requirement that false signals be reinforced across several modalities. In classrooms and war colleges, the Ghost Army served as a case study not only of ingenuity, but of the limits and responsibilities of manipulating perception. When one steps back from the technical specifics and the classified memos, the enduring image of the Ghost Army is paradoxical. It is an army that never fired a shot, but whose artifice had shots fired in its name. A unit whose greatest victories are measured in hesitations and redeployments rather than destroyed tanks. It reminds us that war is not only the collision of steel and will, but also a competition over belief, about where danger is, what forces exist, and what moves are prudent. Controlling belief can shape the battlefield as effectively as controlling bridges or high ground. At the end of the story, the moral center does not point to easy answers. Creativity in service of defense can be praised for saving lives, but it can also be questioned for the ways it relocates hazard. Secrecy may sharpen operational effect while dulling public accountability. And the same artistic skill that makes illusion convincing can make deception ethically fraught. Those tensions are not vanquished by cleverness. They are the price of waging modern war in which perception is itself a weapon. If you want the full-sourced breakdown of methods and the mission files cited in this account, check the description for primary sources and suggested reading. The links include declassified reports, veteran interviews, and major secondary studies that provide the documentary backbone for these conclusions. For those who study information warfare today, the Ghost Army is not merely an unusual anecdote from 1944. It is a cautionary exemplar. It shows how layered signals create plausible realities, and how humans trust in corroboration, allocate risk accordingly. Whatever one's final moral judgment, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops left a clear imprint on the practice of deception. Their work amplified the importance of corroborated signals, taught militaries to think in multidisciplinary harmonies of sight, sound, and signal, and forced a conversation about the responsibilities of designers, technicians, and commanders who produce and authorize believable falsehoods. The lesson endures. In war, what one side sees and believes is as consequential as what one side holds.
The Ghost Army harnessed that fact with technical artistry and tactical subtlety, and in doing so, it changed, in small but meaningful ways, how battles were chosen and where men stood to fight. Subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden operations of the Second World War. The description contains source links and a reading list for anyone who wants to examine the declassified files and first-hand accounts that underpin this account.